Why are GMOs bad? They're not. They just aren't. Not intrinsically, and certainly not for your health. We've been eating them for decades with no ill effects, which makes sense because a genetically modified organism is simply an organism like any other organism that produces tens of thousands of proteins, but one or two of them were proteins that were chosen specifically by us humans. Genetic engineering is necessary for the continued success of the human experiment here on planet Earth. The fruits of genetic engineering, sometimes literally, will help us face the significant challenges of a world with more and more people and a climate that is less and less stable. GMOs are everywhere in the US. Pretty much literally, 95% of sugar beets, 88% of corn, 94% of soybeans grown in the US contain traits like being insect resistant or herbicide resistant that were engineered into them. And some crops are genetically modified simply for human benefit. Around 500,000 children go blind every year because of a vitamin A deficiency. So a strain of rice has been developed that, unlike normal rice, contains enough vitamin A to keep children healthy. Or healthier, anyway. Now, the term genetically modified organism is actually somewhat of a misnomer. I mean, people have been genetically modifying organisms since the invention of agriculture. Every plant and animal species has natural genetic variability, and for thousands of years we've harnessed this variability by practicing artificial selection. We cultivate and breed organisms to emphasize their most desirable traits. Cows that produce more milk and squash plants that survive drought. Corn originally looked like this. Over years of selective breeding, we have turned it into a massive, crazy, giant mutant version of itself that we happily throw on the grill without thinking of the centuries of breeding necessary to turn a grass seed into a sweet and starchy masterpiece. But when we talk about GMOs today, we're actually talking about genetically engineered organisms, or transgenic organisms. We're talking about genes from one species being extracted and then fused into the genome of a different species. This is called transgenesis, and though not all GMO food is created this way, transgenic crops are by far the most common kind of genetically engineered organisms you come across. But here's the thing, engineered organisms aren't new either. We've been tinkering with food in laboratories for nearly 100 years. In the 1920s, scientists realized that they could cause mutations in plants, thereby creating more genetic diversity and possibly more desirable traits by exposing them to X-rays and gamma rays and various chemicals. Through the 1970s, these methods of mutation breeding were quite popular and completely unregulated and largely ignored by the public. Thousands of cultivars produced this way are currently on the market. It's a kind of brute force hack. Just mess the genes up, plant the seeds, and see what happens, and then breed the cool new traits back into various strains of crops. Now, the GM industry wasn't really able to take hold until 1994 when the USDA approved something called the Flavor Saver tomato, a fruit invented by a California biotech company that was altered so that it took longer to ripen, giving it a longer shelf life. It was the first genetically engineered crop sold to consumers. Let's start with why they were made in the first place. The active ingredient in the herbicide Roundup is glyphosate, a chemical that inhibits an enzyme plants use to synthesize amino acids. By blocking this enzyme, Roundup stops plants from making what they need to grow and metabolize food, thereby killing them. And it pretty much takes no prisoners. So much so that it can be hard to use around plants that you don't want to kill, like your crops. So in the early 1990s, the company that makes Roundup, Monsanto, decided to develop crops that were resistant to glyphosate so farmers could spray the herbicide over their whole crop, but only kill the weeds. See, there are these microorganisms that produce an enzyme that is unaffected by glyphosate. All Monsanto had to do was transfer those bacteria genes to food plants, and farmers could use Roundup to protect their crops without killing them. So they extracted small pieces of bacterial DNA that were responsible for making the enzyme and set about introducing them into plants. At the end of the process, Monsanto had a patented plant that could be sprayed with glyphosate and survive. Previously, plants would have to be seeded far enough apart that machines could till away competing weeds, increasing soil loss and costs to the farmer, not to mention fuel consumption. Plus, Monsanto gets a whole new, massive customer base for glyphosate. It's a long process. The whole thing can take as long as 15 years, but that's how just about all genetic engineering is done to your food. Of course, then there's the process of getting the crop or animal approved for use, which can also take quite a number of years. At the moment, it's extremely expensive, though there are some technologies on the horizon that might make it cheaper. The fact that it's so expensive and yet still economically worth doing indicates how extremely useful lethal GM crops can be. It also means that the companies that produce them closely guard and restrict the patents and sale and growth and even research done on the crop. Of course, the traits we're engineering into crops might have potential ecological effects. Like if we're engineering in insect resistance, we want to make sure that we're not harming the insects that we do like bees and butterflies. But after having been consumed in hundreds of millions of meals by me and probably by you, and having been studied for decades, there has been zero indication that genetically modified food poses a danger to human health. That has not stopped an extremely vocal opposition from funding poorly designed studies and publishing misleading papers. We here at SciShow even reported on a study indicating that GMOs caused an increase in cancer in rats. This study, led by a guy who was not coincidentally publishing a book on the topic that same week, was published in a peer-reviewed journal and was initially taken at face value. But cherry-picked data, a lack of dose response, small sample groups, and a strain of rat that has an 80% chance of developing cancer in its lifespan eventually combined to completely discredit the study. Of course, as with any new technology, it can have unintended consequences, it can be controlled and monopolized and even weaponized, so there's plenty of reason to keep an eye on the companies making these advances. But when considering the number of hungry people on the planet, we have an obligation to explore every possible avenue to increase crop yields and decrease the amount of herbicide, pesticide, energy, and water needed to produce a crop.